Hey there. Like what you see? Smash that like button and subscribe for a front row seat to the weirdest side of history. Are you ready to dive into a world where people believed in unicorns, thought bathing was overrated, and executed criminals with a flair for the dramatic? Buckle up. Did you know that in the Middle Ages, some folks thought it was totally normal to punish thieves by throwing them into a pit filled with ravenous dogs? Yes, you heard that right. And speaking of bizarre practices, have you ever wondered what it was like to live during the dancing plague of 1518, when hundreds of people just couldn't stop grooving, even to their own demise? Talk about a party gone wrong. Imagine a society that believed you could ward off evil spirits by wearing a necklace made of real teeth. Charming, isn't it? Or how about the fact that ancient Romans used urine as mouthwash? Yes, the very same stuff you might avoid on a night out. And don't even get me started on the medieval obsession with trial by ordeal, where you could be declared innocent if you managed to survive being thrown into a river. Spoiler alert, not everyone made it back alive. What do all these oddities tell us about humanity? Why did people embrace such grotesque rituals? And why on earth didn't someone just suggest a good old-fashioned therapy session? Stay tuned as we unravel these bizarre facts and more, complete with specific dates that will make your head spin, from the grisly punishments of 12th century England to the scandalous sexual escapades of ancient Greece. And hey, while you're at it, turn on loop so this episode plays until you drift off into a strange historical dream. Trust me, you won't want to miss a single shocking twist. Ah, the Viking Age. A time of longships, conquests, and, one might say, an unfortunate neglect of hygiene standards on the high seas. While history books have regaled us with tales of pillaging and exploration, what about the often overlooked saga of Viking ship deck scrubbing regulations? Yes, you heard that right. Let's dive into the murky waters of this lackluster history, shall we? The earliest records, a slippery start. Our story begins in the 8th century, specifically around 793 AD in Lindisfarne, England, when the Vikings, having just finished feasting on a hearty breakfast of porridge, decided to pop over for a little light raiding. But what do we know about the state of their ships? Well, there is no surviving evidence of scrubbing regulations. Shocking, I know. You'd think with all that plundering, they'd at least have a mop on board. Fast forward to 865 AD, when the great heathen army, led by the infamous Ivar the Boneless and his brothers, landed in East Anglia. They didn't just bring swords and shields, they brought their delightful assortment of unwashed decks, covered in a fine layer of salt, seaweed, and whatever else had been tracking along from their last raid. Imagine the scene. After a long day of pillaging, they returned to their ships to find a deck so grimy that one might mistake it for a breeding ground for small sea creatures. Was there no respect for cleanliness amongst these marauding Norsemen? The unwritten code, or lack thereof. As we meander through the annals of Viking history, we find ourselves in a regulatory void. The Vikings, you see, were not exactly known for their bureaucratic prowess. There were no scrolls of regulations detailing the proper angle for scrubbing a deck. No Viking equivalent of OSHA to oversee ship cleanliness. Instead, they relied on a curious blend of tradition and sheer willpower. One can only imagine the conversations. "Bjorn, have you scrubbed the deck today?" "Deck? What deck?" "We're too busy planning our next raid." "Fine, but if we slip on that algae, I'm blaming you." The first known documentation of any semblance of nautical cleanliness occurred in 1066, when King Harald Hardrada set sail with his fleet. Legend has it that he decreed, "A clean ship is a happy ship." But did his men listen? Did they heck? Instead, they continued to embrace their grimy ways, perhaps believing that a little dirt added character to their ships. The Golden Age of Unkemptness, 950–1100 AD. During the Golden Age of Viking exploration, from approximately 950 to 1100 AD, ships were built with remarkable craftsmanship, but scrubbing regulations? Not a chance. The longships, sleek and swift, were more likely to be adorned with intricate carvings than with a single brush. One can only speculate the Vikings' reasoning: why scrub the deck when we can conquer new lands? Consider the tale of Sigurd the Stout, who, in 1010, led a fleet to the Mediterranean. Upon arrival, his crew was met not just with gold and riches, but with horrified locals who had never seen a deck so slippery it could double as an ice rink. The locals, fearing for their lives, suggested maybe a scrub would help. To which Sigurd replied, "No, we prefer the natural look." Curious practices, the scrubbing subculture. As we venture deeper into the Viking psyche, we uncover some bizarre and curious practices surrounding the maintenance of their ships. While they may not have had regulations, they certainly had some unique methods. 1. The seaweed scrub. It was widely believed that dragging a handful of seaweed across the deck would naturally exfoliate the wood. Who needs a scrub brush when you have Mother Nature, right? 2. The seagull squeak. Some crews would keep a flock of seagulls on board, claiming they'd squawk the dirt away. While this sounds convenient, it's unclear whether the gulls were more effective at cleaning or just more proficient at creating a mess. 3. The monthly rinse. Every full moon, the crew would engage in a ritualistic deck rinse, which involved tossing buckets of seawater onto the deck. This was less about cleanliness and more about appeasing the sea gods. Did it work? Who knows? But imagine the spectacle, a bunch of burly Vikings splashing water while chanting. What a sight! 4. Mischievous mopping. There were tales of sailors who would use the mops as weapons during quarrels, because nothing says, "I'm angry," like a well-aimed mop to the face. The fateful year of 1066, a turning point. Now, let's circle back to 1066, the year that would go down in infamy, not just for the Battle of Hastings but for the unintentional tide turning in ship cleanliness. As King Harald Hardrada prepared to invade England, his fleet was a sight to behold, if you could see past the grime and muck. Rumor has it that during the fleet's approach, an English lookout shouted, "Look at those ships. They're covered in filth," to which a savvy Viking replied, "That's just our battle armor." But this was the moment when scrubbing regulations began to emerge, albeit reluctantly. With the rise of trade and interaction with the more hygienic cultures of Western Europe, the idea of cleanliness began to creep into the Viking ethos. Could it be that the unkempt warriors were finally seeing the light, or at least the scrub brush? The aftermath, a slow transition. By the late 11th century, as the Viking Age began to wane, so too did the negligence of deck scrubbing. The advent of Christianity brought with it an unexpected emphasis on cleanliness. Monasteries began to advocate for cleanliness in all aspects of life, and ships were no exception. In 1080, a decree from the newly converted King Olaf II of Norway suggested that no ship shall embark without being cleansed, which is quite possibly the most Viking-like way to say, scrub your decks. But was this a genuine shift in behavior? While some Viking ships began to feature rudimentary cleaning supplies, think rough cloths and possibly even a wooden bucket, the overall enthusiasm for cleanliness remained tepid at best. Perhaps the Vikings were too busy raiding, trading, and plundering to worry about a little grime. Conclusion: the legacy of deck scrubbing regulations. So where does that leave us? The lackluster history of Viking ship deck scrubbing regulations is not merely a tale of grime and neglect, it's a reflection of a culture that prioritized conquest over cleanliness. Would a few scrub brushes have changed the course of history? Perhaps not. But it's hard not to chuckle at the image of these fierce warriors, sailing the seas in ships that could double as a cleaning experiment gone wrong. In the end, the Vikings were a people who embraced chaos, and in their quest for glory, they left behind a legacy that reminds us, sometimes, the most riveting parts of history are found not in the grand tales of glory, but in the small, absurd details, like the scrubbing of a deck that never quite got the attention it deserved. So, the next time you find yourself on a boat, perhaps consider the Viking legacy of cleanliness, or lack thereof. And remember, a clean ship may not always lead to victory, but it sure does make for a more pleasant sailing experience. The lackluster history of Viking ship deck scrubbing regulations. When we think of Vikings, images of fierce warriors, majestic longships, and epic sagas often come to mind. However, lurking beneath the surface of this thrilling narrative is a less glamorous, yet surprisingly detailed, aspect of their maritime legacy: the regulations surrounding deck scrubbing on Viking ships. Yes, you heard it right, deck scrubbing. This mundane task was the subject of numerous rules, roles, and even the occasional bureaucratic punishment. So, grab your scrubbing brush and let's dive into the lackluster, yet oddly fascinating, history of Viking ship deck scrubbing regulations. ### Construction methods and materials, 800 to 1000 AD. Viking ships, particularly the iconic longships, were marvels of engineering. Constructed primarily from oak, their hulls were designed for speed and agility. The construction process was labor-intensive, requiring skilled artisans who employed techniques like clinker building. This method involved overlapping wooden planks, secured with iron rivets, ensuring the vessel was both strong and flexible. However, the materials used for the deck were often less glamorous. The decks were typically made from thinner wood planks, often cedar or pine, which were more susceptible to wear and tear, especially when exposed to the elements and the inevitable grime from sea voyages. The wear from saltwater, algae, and, let's face it, Viking foot traffic made regular scrubbing not just advisable, but necessary. The costs of these ships were astronomical for the time. A longship could set a chieftain back about 300 silver coins, equivalent to a small fortune. Given this investment, maintaining the ship's cleanliness became paramount. A dirty deck could lead to rot, attract pests, and in a worst-case scenario, result in a ship that was more of a floating health hazard than a formidable vessel. ### bureaucratic rules and punishments, 1000 to 1100 AD. As the Viking Age progressed, so did a burgeoning sense of order amid the chaos of raiding and trading. This led to the establishment of maritime codes that included specific regulations regarding deck scrubbing. By the early 11th century, the Gulating Law, one of the earliest compilations of Norse laws, included clauses that pertained to the upkeep of ships. Under these regulations, failing to properly scrub the deck was considered a serious offense. Punishments varied from fines to public embarrassment, and in extreme cases, a shipowner could find themselves at the local thing, a governing assembly, facing a panel of disgruntled shipmates. Imagine standing before a jury of your peers, all judging your deck's hygiene levels. It's enough to make even the fiercest Viking shudder. To add a humorous twist, the punishment for neglecting deck scrubbing was often a public, deck cleaning ceremony, where the offender had to scrub the deck in front of the entire community. One can only imagine the shame of being forced to scrub alongside, say, an angry ship captain who never let you forget it. You think you're a great warrior? Well, great warriors keep their decks clean. ### roles and job descriptions. With the importance of deck scrubbing recognized by Viking leaders, roles began to emerge within the crew specifically for this task. The ship's company typically consisted of a captain, a helmsman, and several rowers, but deck scrubbing required a dedicated team. 1. Deck scrubber. This was not merely a title, it was a position of pride. Deck scrubbers were responsible for maintaining the cleanliness of the ship's deck, utilizing tools made from animal hides and brushes fashioned from coarse plant fibers. Often, these scrubbers were the youngest members of the crew, tasked with this vital role as a rite of passage. It was said that a deck scrubber could earn their sea legs faster than any warrior, as they spent hours scrubbing while the sea tossed the ship about. 2. Deck supervisor. A more senior role, this individual oversaw the scrubbing efforts, ensuring that the task was done efficiently. The supervisor wielded a special wooden staff, known as the cleaning cudgel, which was less about punishment and more about directing the scrubbing teams. Think of them as the Viking equivalent of a stern but fair gym coach, yelling motivational phrases like, "Scrub harder. The sea won't clean itself." 3. Rations manager. While not directly involved in scrubbing, this role was crucial. The rations manager ensured that the scrubbing crew received adequate food and drink to keep their energy up. After all, a well-fed scrubber is a productive scrubber. They were known to keep a stash of dried fish and meat close at hand, ensuring that no one fainted mid-scrub. Hashtag technical specs and inventories. The scrubbing process, while seemingly simple, had its own technical specifications and inventories. Viking ships would carry a limited amount of supplies, and scrubbing tools were among the most essential. By the late 10th century, the inventory of a typical longship included 1. Scrubbing brushes. These were made from sturdy, fibrous materials and often measured around 12 inches in diameter. Some were even crafted from the bristles of boars, ensuring a vigorous clean. 2. Soap. Yes, the Vikings had their version of soap. Made from lye and animal fat, it was both a cleaning agent and a source of smell. While most ships didn't carry much soap, it was expensive. The scrubbing crew would often improvise with seawater and sand. 3. Buckets. Each ship carried at least 2 buckets, usually made from wood or leather, for collecting seawater. It was essential to have sufficient water for the scrubbing process. One could argue that the Vikings were the original bucket brigade, albeit with a more rugged twist. 4. Rags. These made from old sails or worn-out clothes were also vital. A ship's inventory would typically include at least 5 to 10 rags, depending on the size of the crew. A clean rag was a point of pride among scrubbers, and they would often trade tips on where to find the best rags. Hashtag the scrubbing process, a day in the life. So, what did a typical day of deck scrubbing look like? Let's paint a picture. 0700 hours, the sun rises over the horizon, and the crew assembles on deck. After a hearty breakfast of porridge and dried fish, the captain gathers everyone for a morning briefing. Today, we scrub, he bellows, and the crew, half-heartedly, cheers. 0730 hours, the deck scrubbers gather their brushes and buckets, readying themselves for the day's work. The deck supervisor, with his cleaning cudgel in hand, gives a motivational speech, reminding them that clean decks lead to happy voyages. 0800 hours, the scrubbing begins in earnest. The scrubbers work in pairs, one pouring seawater while the other scrubs furiously. The ship sways gently, and they steady themselves against the mast. If only we could scrub the sea itself, one scrubber jokes, prompting chuckles from the others. 1200 hours, midday breaks for lunch. The scrubbers sit together, sharing stories of the last raid while munching on hardtack and sipping mead. You know, if they made a mead-flavored soap, we'd really be onto something, one scrubber quips, eliciting laughter. 1300 hours, refreshed and ready, the crew returns to work. The supervisor spots a corner that's been neglected. You there? Get scrubbing, he barked, brandishing his cudgel for emphasis. 1600 hours, after hours of scrubbing, the deck is finally clean. The captain inspects the work, nodding with approval. Well done, crew. We've earned our place among the gods of cleanliness. Hashtag conclusion, the legacy of scrubbing regulations. While the scrubbing of Viking ship decks may seem trivial compared to their legendary voyages and battles, it played a crucial role in ensuring the longevity of these magnificent vessels. The regulations that govern this task reflect a surprising level of organization and respect for craftsmanship. Though the tales of Viking raids may overshadow the mundane realities of ship maintenance, the legacy of deck scrubbing lives on. After all, it's the unsung heroes, the deck scrubbers, who kept the ship seaworthy, allowing their comrades to sail forth into the annals of history. In the grand scheme of things, the Viking Age was a time of brutal conquests and grand adventures, but one cannot underestimate the importance of a well-scrubbed deck. So, the next time you find yourself on a boat, take a moment to appreciate the humble scrubber. Without them, the seas might just be a little too salty and a lot less shipshape. The lackluster history of Viking ship deck scrubbing regulations. When we think of the Vikings, we imagine fierce warriors, daring explorers, and master shipbuilders. However, lurking behind the grand narratives of conquest and discovery is an equally fascinating but often overlooked aspect of their maritime culture, the humble and lackluster history of deck scrubbing regulations. These regulations may not have inspired epic sagas, but they reveal a world of construction methods, bureaucratic rules, and the daily toil that kept those longships sailing. Construction methods, materials, and costs. The longship, a hallmark of Viking naval architecture, was constructed using a method called clinker building, which involved overlapping planks, strakes, to create a flexible yet sturdy hull. The primary materials used were oak and pine, prized for their durability and availability in the Nordic forests. 1. Materials. Oak. The backbone of longship construction, oak was used for the hull and frames. Typically, a single longship required around 300 trees, costing approximately 10 silver pieces per ship in the early medieval period. Pine. Lighter and used for masts and decks, pine was cheaper, averaging around 5 silver pieces per tree. Iron. Used for nails and fittings, iron was costly and sourced from local forges. A ship would need over 1,000 nails, each costing about 1 silver piece. 2. Costs. A complete longship could set a chieftain back by 50 to 100 silver pieces, depending on size and embellishments. This amount was significant, given that a skilled craftsman might earn just 1 silver piece per day. 3. Deck materials. Decks were typically made from thinner planks of oak, which required regular maintenance and scrubbing to prevent rot from the saltwater and the inevitable accumulation of barnacles and other marine life. So, while the longship was a marvel of engineering, its upkeep was anything but glamorous. After all, who wants to spend their days scrubbing decks when they could be raiding the coasts of England? 2. Bureaucratic rules and punishments ****. Despite the rough-and-tumble image of Viking life, there was a surprising amount of bureaucratic oversight regarding ship maintenance, including the scrubbing of decks. The Viking Age, about 793–1066 AD, was marked by the establishment of various laws and regulations, often codified in local assemblies known as Thing. 1. Key regulations. Every longship must undergo a thorough scrub every fortnight during sailing season, April to September. The captain was responsible for maintaining the cleanliness of the ship, but failure to do so resulted in fines or public shaming during the Thing. If a ship was found unfit for sailing due to neglect, the captain could lose their ship entirely, a fate worse than death for a Viking. 2. Punishments. Fines ranged from 2 to 10 silver pieces, depending on the severity of neglect. Public shaming involved placing the captain's name on a dirtiest deck list, and let's be honest, no Viking wanted to be that guy. Repeat offenders faced the ultimate humiliation, being forced to scrub the decks of rival ships, a fate that no self-respecting Norseman would want to endure. 3. Bureaucratic hierarchy. The ship's captain was at the top, but right below him were the steersman and the deck scrubbing crew, known colloquially as the scrubbers. 3. Roles and job descriptions ****. The hierarchy aboard a Viking longship reflected both the social order of their society and the practical needs of sailing. Each role was critical, and yes, even the scrubbers had a place of honor, albeit a soggy one. 1. Captain. The captain commanded the ship, made decisions on routes, and oversaw all operations, including deck scrubbing. His leadership was akin to a CEO, but with more axes and fewer board meetings. 2. Steersman. The steersman was responsible for navigation and steering. They had a keen sense of the stars and tides but were often too busy to notice how dirty the decks were getting. 3. Scrubbers. Typically made up of younger crew members or those seeking redemption for past misdeeds, or simply on the bottom rung of the social ladder, scrubbers wielded their brushes like warriors wielded swords. Their duties included scrubbing the deck with a mixture of seawater and sand to remove grime, ensuring that the ship's hull was free from barnacles, which was crucial for speed and maneuverability. The scrubbers formed a bond over their mutual disdain for algae, and their camaraderie often led to the invention of songs that would echo through the fjords, though they were seldom recorded in the sagas. 4. Technical specs and inventories ****. The technical specifications of the longship reflected both its ingenuity and the practical needs of scrubbing. The average longship measured around 75 feet in length and 15 feet in width, with a shallow draft of about 3 feet, allowing for beach landings and river navigation. 1. Specifications. Length, 75 feet. Width, 15 feet. Draft, 3 feet. Sail area, approximately 800 square feet. Crew size, 20 to 30 men, depending on the size of the ship. 2. Inventory. Scrubbing brushes. Each ship was required to carry at least 5 brushes made from stiff bristles, usually crafted from animal hair. Buckets. 2 standard-sized wooden buckets were necessary for carrying seawater to the deck. Rags. A collection of worn-out tunics or cloaks repurposed for drying off the deck after scrubbing. 3. Maintenance checklist. Inspect the hull for barnacles, every Sunday. Check the rigging for frays, every Saturday. Scrub the deck, every fortnight. Replace brushes as needed, at least once per sailing season. In an era without spreadsheets or project management software, keeping track of all this must have felt akin to herding cats, but with more splinters and fewer complaints. V. The legacy of scrubbing regulations ***. While the Viking Age came to an end around 1066 AD, the legacy of deck scrubbing regulations remained embedded in seafaring culture. As longships transitioned into the medieval period, the regulations evolved but never fully vanished. The emphasis on maintaining a clean vessel persisted into the age of exploration, albeit with fewer public shaming rituals and more emphasis on hygiene. 1. Cultural impact. Ships continued to be seen as a reflection of their captain's honor. A clean ship symbolized a competent leader. The art of scrubbing became an accepted rite of passage for young sailors, fostering a sense of camaraderie and teamwork, though they would likely have preferred to be practicing their swordplay. 2. Modern echoes. Today, the maritime world continues to emphasize cleanliness and maintenance, although the bureaucratic penalties have become more civilized. Thankfully, no more public humiliation. The legacy of scrubbing has even found its way into pop culture, with modern pirate films often depicting swashbuckling heroes taking a break from treasure hunting to scrub the decks, a nod to the unsung heroes of the Viking Age. 6. Conclusion ***. The history of Viking ship deck scrubbing regulations may not fill the pages of history books with tales of gallant battles or legendary voyages, but it offers a fascinating glimpse into the everyday lives of those intrepid sailors. From the construction of their vessels to the bureaucratic oversight that governed their maintenance, the scrubbing of decks was an essential duty that kept the Viking fleet afloat. So, the next time you think of Vikings, remember that behind the tales of glory and conquest lay the less glamorous, yet equally important, world of scrubbers wielding brushes and battling the grime of the seas. After all, every great journey begins with a clean deck, because nobody wants to sail into battle with a barnacle-covered bow. #The lackluster history of Viking ship deck scrubbing regulations. In the grand saga of Viking exploration, conquests, and trades, one might think that the tales of valiant warriors and daring voyages would dominate the narrative. However, lurking in the shadows of history is a surprisingly dull yet crucial aspect of Viking maritime culture: the regulations surrounding deck scrubbing. Yes, even the most fearsome warriors wielded a deck brush, and it's time to explore the mundane yet fascinating history of Viking ship deck scrubbing regulations. #Construction methods and materials. When we talk about Viking longships, we often picture majestic vessels slicing through icy waters, but let's not overlook the decks of these ships, crafted with the same care as their hulls. Viking ships were primarily constructed from oak, a durable wood that could withstand the rigors of the sea. The deck itself was built using planks of this oak, laid down with precision. They were often caulked with wool or animal hair mixed with tar to prevent leaks. Costs and resources. Building a Viking ship was no small feat and certainly not cheap. A longship could cost upwards of 50 marks of silver, which was a significant investment during the Viking Age, approximately 793–1066 AD. This hefty price tag included the labor and materials for the hull, mast, and, not to forget, the deck. However, while the ship was a monumental investment, the materials required for deck scrubbing were far less extravagant. A simple brush made from reeds or bristles tied to a wooden handle sufficed. The cost of such a tool: a mere 2 silver coins, or a day's wages for a lowly deckhand. And let's be honest, if scrubbing decks had been as glamorous as sailing into battle, perhaps the Vikings would have celebrated deck scrubbing with songs of glory rather than relegating it to the most tedious chore aboard. ## bureaucratic rules and punishments. By the 10th century, as Viking culture began to settle into more structured societies, regulations emerged to govern the art of deck scrubbing. The laws of the sea, or so they were called, outlined specific duties for crew members and enforced penalties for those who did not adhere to them. ## scrubbing regulations. 1. Daily scrubbing. Every ship's deck was required to be scrubbed at least once daily. Failure to do so resulted in a penalty of 5 silver coins, a considerable sum for a sailor. 2. Seasonal deep cleaning. At the start of each sailing season, a thorough scrubbing was required, involving not just brushes but also the use of seawater mixed with a dash of vinegar, the Viking equivalent of a modern cleaning solution. 3. Responsibility assignments. Each crew member had specific days assigned for deck scrubbing. A rotating schedule ensured fairness and kept everyone on their toes. 4. Inspections. The ship's captain, or the skipper, as they were known, was responsible for conducting inspections. If the deck failed to meet cleanliness standards, the offending scrubber faced a stern reprimand. ## punishments. Oh, the punishments. Picture this: a sailor, exhausted from battle and rough seas, is caught with a dirty deck. The punishment? A day spent scrubbing the deck alone while the rest of the crew feasted on salted fish and meat. If a crew member was particularly egregious in their negligence, they could face the scrubber's gauntlet, where fellow sailors would toss seaweed and fish guts at the offender while they scrubbed the deck, an embarrassing yet effective method of ensuring compliance. ## roles and job descriptions. The Viking longship crew was a well-oiled machine, with each member having their own distinct role. While most roles revolved around navigation or combat, the deck scrubbers, often labeled as "skirts," had their own niche responsibilities. ## key roles. 1. Skipper, captain, in charge of the ship's overall operations, including inspections and assigning scrubbing duties. 2. First mate, FYRD, assisted the skipper and was responsible for maintaining morale among the crew and ensuring scrubbing tasks were completed. 3. Skirds, deck scrubbers, the unsung heroes of the crew. The skirds were tasked with keeping the deck clean. They rotated duties based on a schedule, ensuring that everyone got their hands dirty, literally. 4. Oarsmen. While primarily focused on propulsion, oarsmen were also required to help scrub when not rowing. Picture a burly Viking, muscles rippling, scrubbing away like he's preparing for a longship beauty contest. 5. Apprentices. Young boys training to become full-fledged crew members often took on the role of deck scrubber as part of their initiation. ## technical specs and inventories. Viking ships were marvels of engineering, and their decks were no exception. The specifications for a typical longship deck included ###dimensions. Length, approximately 30 to 40 meters, 100 to 130 feet. Width, about 5 to 6 meters, 16 to 20 feet. Deck height, typically 1 meter, 3 feet, above the waterline. ###materials inventory. Wood type, primarily oak, with some decks using pine or ash for specific sections. Deck planks, roughly 15 to 20 centimeters wide, 6 to 8 inches, and 2 to 3 centimeters thick, 1 inch. Caulking materials, wool or animal hair mixed with tar. Scrubbing tools, simple brushes made from reeds or bristles with wooden handles. ###maintenance supplies. 1. Vinegar, for the deep cleaning solution. 2. Salt, to sprinkle on the deck after scrubbing to prevent algae growth. 3. Brooms, made from twisted reeds for sweeping larger debris. ###the downside of deck scrubbing. While scrubbing may seem like a mundane task, the reality was often much more entertaining. For instance, due to the nature of the Viking diet, which consisted of a lot of fish, the decks often became slippery with fish guts and scales. This created a rather comical, and dangerous, scenario. The deck scrubbers often needed to navigate their own slippery terrain to ensure the rest of the crew didn't end up doing the Viking equivalent of a ballet on deck. ###the scrubbing songs. To make the chore more bearable, Skurds often sang scrubbing songs. These tunes, while not exactly chart toppers, helped build camaraderie amongst the crew. Lyrics typically included verses about the merits of a clean deck and the dangers of slippage. One popular line went something like, "A clean deck is a happy ship, don't let the fish guts make you trip." #conclusion. In the grand tapestry of Viking history, it's easy to overlook the significance of deck scrubbing regulations. While tales of raids and explorations capture our imaginations, the reality of life aboard a Viking longship was filled with the mundane tasks that ensured the ship remained seaworthy. From the construction of durable decks to the bureaucratic regulations that govern scrubbing duties, every detail played a role in the success of Viking maritime endeavors. And while the thought of scrubbing decks might not summon images of glory, it certainly highlights the commitment of these seafaring warriors to their ships, and perhaps provides a solid argument for why they were so successful in their ventures. So next time you think of Vikings, don't just picture them brandishing axes and shields. Remember the unsung heroes armed with brushes and brooms, battling the grime of the sea, because, in the end, it was the clean decks that kept the Viking legacy afloat. The lackluster history of Viking ship deck scrubbing regulations. When one thinks of Vikings, images of ferocious warriors storming across the seas come to mind, certainly not a fleet of meticulously maintained ships with well-regulated scrubbing policies. However, the reality is a bit less glamorous. Viking ship deck scrubbing regulations, while far from exciting, tell a tale of construction methods, bureaucratic nonsense, and the everyday lives of those who sailed the seas. So, grab your scrub brushes and let's dive into this underwhelming yet fascinating history. Hashtag construction methods, materials, and costs. Viking ships, primarily constructed between the 8th and 11th centuries, were marvels of their time. With longships designed for speed and agility, and knars built for cargo transport, these vessels were crucial to the Norse way of life. Hashtag construction methods. 1. Clinker building. Vikings utilized the clinker method, overlapping wooden planks to create a strong, flexible hull. This was particularly effective for navigating the tumultuous seas and shallow rivers. 2. Keel construction. The keel, often made from oak, provided the foundational strength for the ship. The labor-intensive process required skilled craftsmen, who could spend weeks shaping and fitting each piece. 3. Ribbing. The ribs of the ship, typically made from flexible wood like ash or birch, were fitted to the keel. This skeleton-like structure supported the hull's integrity. Hashtag materials. Wood types. Oak was the primary choice for both the keel and hull due to its durability, while lighter woods like pine were favored for masts and oars. Iron fastenings, nails and rivets, forged from local iron ore, held the planks together. Despite the high cost of iron, at least 2 cows per ton, according to some estimates, these fastenings were essential for ship construction. Hashtag costs. Building a Viking ship could set a chieftain back anywhere from 400 to 1,200 silver coins, depending on size and complexity. In modern terms, that's roughly equivalent to purchasing a small house, if the house were made of wood, had a dragon head on the prow, and was designed for pillaging. Hashtag bureaucratic rules and punishments. Once ships were built, it became evident that scrubbing the decks was not just an aesthetic choice, it was critical for maintaining the integrity of the vessel. Enter the Byzantine world of Viking regulations. Hashtag rules. 1. Deck cleaning frequency. The Althing, the Viking assembly, mandated that decks be scrubbed at least twice a fortnight, an ambitious goal, considering the sailing schedule. 2. Materials used. Only specific types of brushes crafted from goat hair or reeds were sanctioned. Improvised scrubbing tools could lead to varying degrees of punishment, depending on severity. 3. Cleaning areas. Commanders were required to designate specific cleaning zones, ensuring that no one could claim the entire deck as their personal territory for scrubbing. Hashtag punishments. Failure to comply with these regulations often led to swift consequences. Fines. Offenders could be fined up to half a cow, as determined by the local chieftain, an unfortunate dent in one's livestock collection. Public scrubbing. More serious violations could result in public shaming, where the offender would have to scrub the deck in front of the entire crew, often leading to a rather soggy humiliation. Keel hauling. In extreme cases, though primarily reserved for piracy rather than scrubbing offenses, keel hauling was a method of punishment that involved dragging the offender under the ship. Not the best way to maintain morale or cleanliness. Hashtag roles and job descriptions. Viking ships required a well-defined hierarchy to operate efficiently, even if the scrubbing regulations seemed trivial compared to raiding. Here's a rundown of key roles aboard a Viking longship. 1. Skipper, or steersman, the captain of the ship, responsible for navigation and discipline. Skippers often had to ensure that deck scrubbing was completed, lest they face the wrath of their crew. 2. First mate, or helmsman, this individual assisted the skipper and had a keen eye for cleanliness. They were responsible for enforcing scrubbing regulations, essentially the fun police of the ship. 3. Deckhands, these were the grunts of the crew, responsible for carrying out scrubbing orders. Their job descriptions included not only swabbing the decks but also raising sails and manning oars. 4. Shipwrights, while not always aboard, these craftsmen were responsible for maintaining the ships in port. They often grumbled about the scrubbing regulations, claiming that a clean ship was a ship destined to sail less, a theory not widely accepted. 5. Scrubbers, an honorary title for the designated deck cleaners, who were often the newest crew members. Scrubbing was considered a rite of passage, complete with initiation rituals involving an absurd amount of water and laughter. While it may seem that a Viking ship was all about combat and adventure, the daily grind of deck maintenance was a significant part of life at sea. One can only imagine the conversations. What do you think about the new scrubbing regulations? I don't know, Bjorn, but I'd rather be raiding. #### technical specs and inventories. To fully appreciate the scrubbing regulations, one must grasp the technical aspects of these magnificent ships. Here's a look at some specifications that would have made any modern naval architect weep with envy, or confusion. #### general specs. Length. Typical longships ranged from 70 to 100 feet, providing ample deck space for scrubbing. Width. A beam of 15 to 20 feet allowed for a stable platform, conducive to scrubbing practices. Draft. With a shallow draft of about 3 feet, these ships could navigate rivers, leading to frequent scrubbing in unexpected locations, like the middle of a fjord. #### inventory. 1. Scrubbing brushes. Approximately 10 brushes were kept aboard per ship, ready for action. 2. Buckets. Each ship had 3 designated buckets made from wood or leather for carrying soap, often a mix of ash and fat, and water. 3. Sails. Made from wool or linen, sails required regular scrubbing, especially after long voyages. #### The scrubbing process, a step-by-step guide. Let's not forget the actual process of scrubbing the decks, which was a regimented affair, even if it lacked the excitement of battle. Here's how it went down. 1. Gather supplies. Scrubbers would first collect their brushes, buckets, and soap, forming a small army against grime. 2. Water fetching. They would lower buckets over the side to fill them with seawater, an exercise that often led to wet feet and curses. 3. Lather up. Using the collected seawater and soap, the scrubbers would create a lather, which they would then apply to the deck. 4. Scrub. This was where the real work began. Each scrubber had a specific section of the deck, which they would meticulously clean. 5. Rinse and repeat. After scrubbing, buckets would be reused to rinse the deck off, because no one wanted to slip on their own hard work. ###The end of scrubbing regulations. As Vikings transitioned from raiders to settlers, the strict scrubbing regulations faded into obscurity. The need for deck scrubbing became less pressing as ships were docked more permanently. The last recorded instance of scrubbing regulations being enforced was in 1100 AD, when a particularly ambitious chieftain attempted to revive the old ways among a community of settlers. In the end, Viking ship deck scrubbing regulations serve as a reminder that even the most fearsome warriors had to deal with mundane tasks. They might have sailed the seas in search of glory, but they also grappled with the drudgery of keeping their ships clean, perhaps with a bit of scrubbing humor to lighten the load. As one Viking might have put it, what's the point of raiding if you can't at least enjoy a clean deck afterwards? In conclusion, while the history of Viking ship deck scrubbing may lack the drama of epic battles, it offers a unique glimpse into the daily lives of these seafaring warriors. The next time you think of Vikings, consider not just their conquests but also the unsung heroes armed with brushes, scrubbing away the grime of adventure. After all, even in the heart of battle, someone had to keep the ship clean, and that someone was probably not the one wielding the sword. ###The lackluster history of Viking ship deck scrubbing regulations. The Vikings. Brave seafarers, fierce raiders, and now, thanks to a surprisingly robust collection of historical documents, the unwitting stars of an unglamorous saga involving deck scrubbing regulations. Yes, you heard that right. While Hollywood has turned them into leather-clad warriors with flowing hair and battle axes, in reality, many of those fearsome Norsemen were likely more concerned about the crusty build-up on their decks than their next raid. So grab your horned helmet and prepare for a dive into the murky waters of Viking ship deck scrubbing regulations. Spoiler alert, it's not as glamorous as it sounds. #######regional variations over time. To really appreciate the dullness of Viking deck scrubbing regulations, we must first acknowledge the vast geographical expanse of the Viking world. From the fjords of Norway to the rivers of Russia, the Vikings navigated their longships through a veritable buffet of climates, water conditions, and, crucially, deck muck. In the fjords of Norway, the combination of salty sea spray and the occasional fish guts from a bad catch meant that scrubbing decks was a near-daily affair. Local edicts mandated that every longship must undergo a scrubbing every fortnight, lest the smell of stale fish become the dominant scent in their coastal villages. Who would want to raid a town when you could smell like a herring factory? Meanwhile, in the warmer climes of the British Isles, where Vikings were more likely to encounter mud than fish, scrubbing regulations were less about scrubbing and more about logistics. Here, the focus wasn't on removing the salt and slime, but on ensuring that the deck was free of the mud that could slow down the ship's speed. Thus, laws were enacted that required a thorough wash after every landing. A post-landing scrubbing tax was even introduced in some regions, which essentially meant that every time a Viking stepped off their ship, they were expected to pay up if they didn't scrub the mud off. In the east, where Vikings traveled down the Volga and into the heart of Russia, scrubbing regulations took on a whole new level of absurdity. Local rulers insisted on keeping scrubbing logs, yes, you heard that right, detailing not only when a ship was scrubbed but also who did the scrubbing and with what materials. Lars, I see you used that cheap straw broom again. You'll need to redo it with the proper brushes or face the consequences. Forget the sword, that was the kind of reprimand that struck fear into a Viking's heart. ###### laws, edicts, taxes, and ledgers. As with any good historical narrative, the Vikings' deck scrubbing regulations came with their own set of laws and taxes. You might think that a society known for its pillaging would have more pressing matters to focus on, but alas, deck cleanliness was a surprisingly hot-button issue. For example, King Harald Fairhair of Norway once issued an edict that mandated a clean ship tax. The tax was determined by the size of the ship and the number of scrubbing brushes on board. The more scrubbing implements a Viking possessed, the more they were taxed. Naturally, this led to a flourishing black market for low-quality brushes made from horsehair, which were considered subpar for the purpose of deck scrubbing. I swear, Bjorn, if I see you using one of those horsehair abominations again, I'll have you swimming with the fish. What's even more entertaining is that these laws were often recorded in ledgers that were meticulously kept by local chieftains or ship captains. These ledgers would include detailed accounts of scrubbing duties, who was assigned to them, and how often the decks were cleaned. Some records even contained complaints from disgruntled deck scrubbers, like, "I refuse to scrub the deck after Bjorn spilled meat all over it again." Imagine those records being unearthed centuries later, with historians scratching their heads over why Bjorn always seemed to be in the thick of deck scrubbing drama. Who knew that Viking history would be preserved through such mundane complaints? ##### logistics and supply chains. Now, let's talk logistics. Vikings were not just warriors, they were also surprisingly adept at managing supply chains. You'd think that raiding and plundering would take up most of their time, but they actually dedicated significant resources to deck scrubbing supplies. Scrubbing brushes, buckets, and soap were all part of the Viking maritime supply chain. The best scrubbing brushes were made from a combination of sturdy twigs and soft straw, and could be found at the local market in the coastal towns. However, with all the raiding, you can imagine how the supply of these essential scrubbing tools could dwindle. A Viking captain might find himself in a tight spot, staring at a ship that's more slime than wood, all because his last raid didn't yield enough scrubbing brushes. The logistics of keeping a ship clean also extended to the sourcing of soap. The Vikings had a unique approach to soap making, often using animal fats and ash. This meant that the more raids they conducted, the more soap they could produce. But when the raids were sparse, well, let's just say that deck scrubbing took on a more primitive flavor. Gunnar, if you don't scrub the deck with something other than your bare hands, we're going to have a serious hygiene problem on this ship. ##### record keeping with lots of specifics. The Vikings' penchant for record keeping is often overshadowed by their more exciting exploits. Still, one cannot overlook the sheer absurdity of the meticulous records they kept about deck scrubbing. Some examples include the deck scrubbing ledger of 874 AD, where every entry contained the date, time, and the names of those who participated. For instance, an entry might read, August 15th, Sven, Lars, and Bjorn scrubbed the deck at 2 p.m. Result, moderate success, but a persistent fish odor remains. There were even incidents where scrubbing results were categorized by type, such as light scrubbing, for when the ship had only recently docked, heavy scrubbing, for when a particularly nasty raid left the ship caked in filth, and the dreaded emergency scrubbing, for when a ship was about to enter port and needed to look presentable. Moreover, there were scrubbing competitions, where crews would pit their deck cleaning skills against each other, and the winners would receive a prize of mead and the title of cleanest crew. Talk about high stakes. Hashtag a surprising, borderline grotesque anecdote. And now, dear reader, we reach the piece de resistance of our tale, the anecdote that has left historians and casual readers alike with a grimace on their faces. In the year 878 AD, a Viking ship returned from a particularly successful raid in Ireland, laden with treasures, including several barrels of ale. However, the crew had not accounted for one critical detail: the ship's deck was absolutely rancid after weeks at sea. The fish guts, spilled mead, and other unmentionables had created a biohazard zone that would put any modern health inspector to shame. In a fit of desperation, the captain ordered an emergency deck scrubbing, but the crew, still slightly inebriated from their celebrations, took it upon themselves to improvise. They decided to mix the contents of a few barrels, ale, fish guts, and whatever other detritus they could find, and create a cleaning solution. The result? A concoction so potent that it not only cleaned the deck but also attracted every nearby seagull within a 5-mile radius. As the birds descended upon the ship, the crew found themselves in a bizarre battle against nature. Picture it, a gaggle of Vikings, armed with scrubbing brushes, fending off a swarm of seagulls while trying to reclaim their deck from both filth and feathery fury. In the end, the ship was declared clean by the captain, but only after the crew had to deal with the aftermath: seagull droppings everywhere and a deck that smelled more like a pub than a ship. This unfortunate incident was recorded in the annals of Viking history not as a tale of bravery or conquest but as a cautionary story about the perils of mixing alcohol with scrubbing duties. Conclusion. So there you have it, a riveting journey through the lackluster history of Viking ship deck scrubbing regulations. While the world remembers the Vikings for their raids and conquests, let us not forget the unsung battles fought against grime and odors aboard their longships. Who knew that the Viking Age would also usher in an era of scrubbing logs, cleaning taxes, and logistical nightmares? As we raise our horns in tribute to these fierce seafarers, let's not overlook the true heroes, the deck scrubbers. Because while they may not have been immortalized in sagas, without their diligent scrubbing, the Vikings might have been known more for their stench than their conquests. Scow. The lackluster history of Viking ship deck scrubbing regulations. If there's one thing history has taught us, it's that while Vikings were busy pillaging, raiding, and generally wreaking havoc across Europe, they also had a surprisingly taxing relationship with cleanliness, a fact that would probably send Thor into a fit of laughter. The deck scrubbing regulations of Viking ships might not be the stuff of epic sagas, but they do offer a peek into the less glamorous side of Norse life. So, grab your scrubbing brush, and let's dive into the murky waters of maritime sanitation, complete with a few surprises along the way. #### regional variations over time. To understand the Viking approach to deck scrubbing, we must first acknowledge the diversity of Viking settlements. From the icy fjords of Norway to the sun-kissed shores of the British Isles, these seafaring folk adapted to their environments in remarkable ways. You see, scrubbing regulations weren't a one-size-fits-all affair. Oh no! Depending on the region, the local customs and available resources dictated how one kept their ship spick and span, or at least as clean as a Viking could manage between bouts of pillaging. In Norway, for instance, the harsh weather meant that any scrubbing would likely take place during the brief summer months. Legends from the era, if we can believe them, suggest that Norsemen took advantage of the plentiful soapwort plant that grew wild on the coastlines. This plant was ground into a paste and used as a natural detergent, a far cry from the store-bought stuff we have today. Meanwhile, in the warmer climes of the Mediterranean, Viking traders would discover that a more laissez-faire attitude toward deck cleanliness prevailed. After all, who cared about a little grime when you were trading in spices and silks? It's likely that their scrubbing brushes were used more for ticklish pranks than for actual sanitation. Fast forward a few generations, and the Vikings had settled into various regions, leading to a delightful mishmash of scrubbing practices. In England, for example, the Anglo-Saxons had their own set of regulations regarding ship cleanliness, laws that would make even the most fastidious Viking raise an eyebrow. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle mentions fines imposed on shipowners for failing to keep their vessels clean, which gave rise to a sort of nautical one-upmanship. Your ship looks like a pigsty. At least I scrubbed my deck last month. #### laws, edicts, taxes, ledgers. Now, what's a good scrubbing story without a bit of bureaucratic nonsense? Enter the world of Viking laws, edicts, and taxes, where scrubbing regulations were codified in ways that would make any modern-day tax accountant weep with joy, or despair. As Viking societies evolved, so too did their attitudes toward ship maintenance. By the late 10th century, the establishment of regional laws brought forth a slew of scrubbing edicts that would impress even the most overzealous of cleaning aficionados. Take the infamous Scrubbing Edict of 980, for instance. This little gem, attributed to King Harold Fairhair, mandated that all ships within his realm must be scrubbed at least once a fortnight. Failure to comply resulted in hefty fines that were carefully recorded in ledgers, of course. These ledgers, which are now preserved in some dusty Scandinavian archives, detail everything from the size of ships to the frequency of scrubbing. One particularly amusing entry notes a certain Bjorn the Brawny, who was fined not once, but 3 times in a single summer for his ship, the Sea Slug, being not merely unclean but a veritable floating cesspool. The meticulous record-keeping didn't stop there. Some enterprising individuals even began to specialize in deck scrubbers, charging for their services in a budding maritime economy. Picture it, a young Viking lad, fresh out of his apprenticeship, armed with a bucket of soapwort paste, ready to take on the stench of the high seas. These scrubbing specialists were known to keep detailed logs of their work, including the type of scrub they employed, the number of hours spent, and even the number of deckhands they managed to convince to join in on the fun. This led to a delightful rivalry between scrubbers, akin to a modern-day Yelp review battle. 2 stars, not enough elbow grease, the ship still smelled like a troll's armpit. ### logistics and supply chains. Of course, no discussion of Viking deck scrubbing would be complete without a look at the logistics and supply chains that enabled these regulations to flourish. After all, a deck that's seen the blood of countless enemies, and quite possibly a few unfortunate sea creatures, requires more than just a good scrub. It demands a steady supply of cleaning materials, which the Vikings were not about to let slip through their fingers. Viking longships were often outfitted with designated storage areas for scrubbing supplies. Some ships even boasted specially designed compartments for their soapwort, which was harvested during the summer to ensure a steady supply throughout the year. But here's where things get interesting. The Vikings had a knack for sourcing materials from the lands they raided. Imagine them pillaging a British monastery only to discover a stash of fragrant herbs. Forget the gold. We need those thyme leaves for deck scrubbing. As the years went by, and Viking raids transitioned into a more established trading system, the logistics of deck cleaning became quite sophisticated. Trade routes were established for the exchange of scrubbing goods, leading to a network that stretched from the shores of Greenland to the bustling markets of Constantinople. Ledger entries from this period reveal that soapwort was often traded alongside amber, furs, and, amusingly, the occasional captured sailor who was deemed not scrubbing up to standard. ### record keeping with lots of specifics. When it comes to record keeping, the Vikings might seem like they'd prefer to be out raiding than jotting down their ship scrubbing escapades. However, the reality was that they took their documentation quite seriously. The aforementioned ledgers provide a treasure trove of information on everything from scrubbing frequency to the types of brushes employed. One particularly delightful finders keepers entry details the scrubbing regiment of the Dragon's Breath, a ship known for its ostentatious decorations and equally ostentatious lack of cleanliness. The ship's ledger noted that it required 10 scrubbing brushes of fine goat hair and 3 barrels of soapwort paste for a single scrubbing session. And if you think that's excessive, wait until you hear this. The captain once recorded that the crew had to spend an additional day scrubbing after a particularly rowdy feast where the fish stew ended up more on the deck than in our bellies. In another case, a Viking ship named the Sea Serpent recorded its scrubbing sessions with such specificity that it looked more like the itinerary of a military campaign than a cleaning schedule. It detailed the exact number of scrubbing strokes per crew member, the time spent on each section of the deck, and even the precise angle at which the brushes were held. "If we're going to scrub, we're going to do it right," the captain seemed to proclaim. ### a surprising, borderline grotesque anecdote. Now, for the piece de resistance, a surprising, and frankly borderline grotesque, anecdote that will forever change the way you think about Viking deck scrubbing. In the early 11th century, a ship known as the Stinky Whale became notorious not just for its name but for a legendary incident that reportedly took place during a particularly ill-fated voyage. The tale goes that the crew, eager to impress their captain with their scrubbing prowess, decided to hold a grand competition. The prize? A barrel of the finest mead in the north. To up the ante, the crew implemented a rather bizarre rule: each contestant had to scrub while balancing a bucket of fish guts on their head. The logic, as the story goes, was that if they could scrub the deck clean while managing the fishy burden, they would truly prove themselves worthy of the title of Master Scrubber. As you can probably guess, things took a turn for the grotesque when one overly zealous crew member, eager to win the competition, slipped and sent fish guts flying in every direction. The result was a deck that was not only unclean but a veritable slip-and-slide of slippery horrors. The captain, upon witnessing the chaos, declared that no good came from mixing scrubbing with fish, and the competition was promptly cancelled. This incident would go down in history as one of the great cautionary tales of Viking lore, a reminder that while the pursuit of cleanliness is noble, sometimes it's best to leave the fish guts for the galley. ###conclusion. So there you have it, the lackluster history of Viking ship deck scrubbing regulations, complete with regional variations, laws, taxes, logistics, and a shocking anecdote to boot. While the Vikings might be remembered for their epic tales of conquest, their struggles against the seas of grime are a testament to the unsung heroes of the high seas, the dedicated deck scrubbers. Next time you find yourself scrubbing your own deck, be it a ship, a patio, or even your kitchen floor, take a moment to appreciate the history that led to this moment. And remember, whether you're armed with soapwort or a modern-day cleaning solution, the spirit of the Vikings lives on in every scrubbing stroke. The lackluster history of Viking ship deck scrubbing regulations, an unfurling of the mundane. Ah, the Viking Age! A time of glorious pillaging, heroic sagas, and high-seas adventure. But amidst the blood-curdling tales of dragon-headed longships cutting through the waves and the clang of swords in epic battles, there lies a story that is far less romantic and infinitely more tedious: the history of Viking ship deck scrubbing regulations. Yes, you heard that right. The scrubbing of decks, a task that would make even the most ardent Norse warrior roll his eyes. Let's dive into this maritime mire, where the salty brine meets bureaucratic indifference. ###regional variations over time. In our modern world, we might think of the Vikings as a monolithic group, united under the banner of horned helmets and violent conquests. However, the reality is much more nuanced. Viking societies were spread across various regions, from the fjords of Norway to the windswept shores of the British Isles. Each area had its own unique scrubbing customs, which, let's be honest, could be as diverse as the Viking hairstyles, and that's saying something. For instance, in the Norse settlements of Greenland, the scrubbing of decks often involved a rather innovative technique known as the glacial grit method. Instead of soap, Greenlandic Vikings would use finely crushed ice and grit to scour their decks, believing that if it could withstand the onslaught of icebergs, it could certainly handle a bit of deck scum. Meanwhile, over in the British Isles, the Vikings took a more pragmatic approach, employing a concoction of soapwort and seawater. The result? A deck that sparkled like the sun on a clear day, or at least as much as one could hope for in the dreary North Atlantic. #### laws, edicts, and taxes. Now, you might think that scrubbing decks would be a free-for-all, a scrappy endeavor undertaken with nothing more than a bucket, a brush, and a hearty laugh. But oh, how wrong you would be. Viking society was nothing if not structured, with laws and edicts governing even the most mundane activities. Deck scrubbing was no exception. In the late 10th century, King Harold Bluetooth, yes, that Bluetooth, issued a decree known as the Skibsklipforordning, or the Ship Scrub Ordinance. This groundbreaking piece of legislation mandated that all longships must be scrubbed every third Wednesday of the month, unless, of course, it was raining, or the ship was out on a raid. In such cases, the scrubbing could be postponed until the next sunny day, or until plunder had been secured. Because let's be honest, who has time to scrub decks when you're busy raiding monasteries for gold and glory? But it didn't stop there. The king also imposed a tax on any ship owner whose vessel was found to be too scummy, with fines ranging from a few sheep to a hefty quantity of mead. Imagine the embarrassment of being publicly shamed for your ship's less-than-stellar hygiene. "Look, there goes Bjorn the Dirty," the villagers would whisper, pointing at the man whose ship bore the telltale signs of neglect. #### logistics and supply chains. You might be wondering, how did the Vikings manage to maintain such a rigorous scrubbing schedule? Well, it turns out that even in the 10th century, the Vikings had a surprisingly sophisticated supply chain for their scrubbing supplies. Long before Amazon Prime made 2-day shipping a thing, Viking ship owners had established trade routes to procure the essential items for deck maintenance. Soapwort, the preferred scrubbing agent, was cultivated in various regions, and local farmers would barter their crops for goods from passing ships. If you found yourself in a bind, you could always rely on the scrub and trade networks, essentially a black market for mild detergents. Rumor has it that a particularly enterprising group of traders in Dublin specialized in genuine Viking soap, which was, in reality, just a mix of lye and whale blubber. Additionally, the logistics of scrubbing weren't just about getting the right supplies, it was also about timing. The Viking calendar was filled with feasts and raids, and any ship owner worth their salt, or soapwort, had to carefully schedule their deck scrubbing around these events. The common phrase, "scrub before you raid," became a mantra, ensuring that no Viking would head out for glory with a grimy ship. #### record keeping with lots of specifics. In an age where literacy was less common than a good cup of coffee, the Vikings were surprisingly adept at record keeping. This wasn't just to keep track of their pillaging, but also to document their scrubbing schedules. Each ship's captain maintained a scrub ledger, where they meticulously recorded the dates of scrubbing, the weather conditions, and any notable comments from crew members. One particularly detailed ledger from the year 986 includes entries like March 23, scrubbed deck with soapwort. Weather sunny, morale high. Crew sang ode to the clean deck. Asterisk. Asterisk April 5th, deck scrubbing postponed due to rain. Raided local farm instead. Found excellent cheese, asterisk. April 15th, ship nearly tipped over during scrubbing, crew member Thorfinn lost a boot. These ledgers were often passed down through generations, becoming a point of pride for families. Imagine a Viking gathering, where tales of valor are interspersed with the critical updates on the scrubbing practices of yore. Ah, yes, old Jarl Rolf. A fine warrior indeed, but let's not forget the great scrub of '95. That deck was cleaner than a newborn seal. Hashtag one surprising, borderline grotesque anecdote. Now, for the piece de resistance, an anecdote so grotesque that it might make you reconsider your dinner plans. In the year 998, during a particularly aggressive scrubbing season, the crew of the longship Skald's Revenge discovered a rather alarming issue. A festering horde of sea lice had taken up residence in the ship's timbers. Upon discovery, the crew, instead of panicking, decided to document the event in their ledger. The entry read, May 12th, discovered sea lice infestation during deck scrubbing. Initiated lice war. All hands on deck, literally. Thorfinn bravely volunteered to test the scrub mixture on his own leg first. What followed was a series of events that could only be described as a combination of a failed science experiment and a gruesome horror story. Thorfinn, in his zeal to rid the Skald's Revenge of the lice, concocted a mixture of soapwort, whale blubber, and some rather questionable herbs he found in a nearby fjord. The result? A noxious sludge that not only failed to eradicate the lice but also attracted every seagull in a 5-mile radius. The crew, horrified, watched as the gulls descended upon the ship in a frenzy, creating a scene that would forever be referred to as the Great Seagull Calamity. The aftermath was legendary. Instead of being celebrated for their bravery, the crew became the butt of every joke in the local taverns. Ah, yes, the brave men of the Skald's Revenge. The only crew to lose a battle against birds. Hashtag conclusion. So there you have it. The lackluster history of Viking ship deck scrubbing regulations, a tale filled with regional quirks, bureaucratic absurdities, and a touch of grotesque humor. As much as we romanticize the Viking Age, it's important to remember that even the greatest warriors had to deal with the mundane realities of life, like scrubbing a deck. Next time you hear an epic saga of Viking glory, just remember that behind every heroic tale lies a ship that may have needed a good scrub, or at least a robust supply of soapwort. And perhaps, just perhaps, a little less attention to the lice. The lackluster history of Viking ship deck scrubbing regulations. Ah, the Vikings. Those seafaring, pillaging, and occasionally overzealous folk who took traveling light to a whole new level. While most history buffs revel in tales of grand conquests and epic battles, little do they know that beneath the blood-soaked surface of Viking lore lies a surprisingly mundane, yet utterly fascinating, tale of ship deck scrubbing regulations. Yes, that's right, folks. Scrubbing. The kind of activity that would put even the most dedicated of modern-day yacht owners to sleep. But before you roll your eyes and scroll down to the next riveting topic, like the evolution of the spatula in Scandinavian cooking, allow me to elucidate the regional variations over time, the laws and taxes that govern the scrubbing of Viking ship decks, the surprisingly complex logistics behind it all, and of course, the meticulous record-keeping that would make even your local accountant weep with envy. Regional variations over time, the Great Scrub-Off. To fully understand the scrubbing regulations, we must first take a geographical jaunt across Scandinavia. Picture it, the year is 930 AD. You're on a longship off the coast of Norway, the air heavy with the smell of salt and, let's just say, an odor that can only be described as troubling. In Norway, it was customary for each ship to have at least one designated deck scrubber, or brigskipper, if you want to sound fancy. These brave souls were not only tasked with using straw brooms and seawater to keep the decks relatively clean, but they were also responsible for maintaining the ship's reputation. A clean ship was a happy ship, or so the sagas would have you believe. Meanwhile, over in Denmark, the deck scrubbing situation was a tad more, let's say, chaotic. With a booming trade in amber and a penchant for raiding English monasteries, the Danes seemed to think that cleanliness was next to godliness. But who had time to scrub when there were gold chalices to be pilfered? Thus, the Danes established the clean deck tax, which levied a hefty fee on any ship returning to port with a grimy deck. Imagine the sight of a grizzled Danish captain grumbling as he hands over a sack of coins to avoid the embarrassing spectacle of being called out for a dirty deck. Now, let's not forget the Swedes. We can't leave them out, can we? In Sweden, the scrubbing regulations were more about the aesthetics of cleanliness rather than any hygienic concern. The Swedes, ever the trendsetters, launched their own line of ship shine, a blend of fish oil and crushed seashells, marketed as the best way to keep your longship's deck as stylish as a Viking's horned helmet. As trade routes expanded, so did the deck scrubbing practices. By the 11th century, Viking ships were not just vehicles for raiding, they were status symbols. A well-scrubbed deck meant you were not only a successful raider but that you also had taste, which, let's be honest, was a rarity in a time when most folks wore the same tunic for weeks on end. Laws, edicts, and taxes, the bureaucratic bonanza. In the world of Viking scrubbing regulations, the law played a surprisingly significant role. You might think that warriors wielding axes wouldn't have much time for clerical work, but you'd be wrong. Viking society was nothing if not organized, with laws and edicts written down and passed around like a gossip magazine among the, well, gossiping Norsemen. The first official scrubbing edict came in 950 AD, under King Harald Fairhair, who, despite his fearsome reputation, was a bit of a neat freak. He decreed that any ship returning to port without a clean deck would be subject to a fine of 3 sheep. Yes, you read that right, 3 sheep. Now, you might be wondering why sheep were the currency of choice for scrubbing fines. Well, let's just say it was a matter of practicality. Ships needed wool for sails, and what better way to ensure that your crew was motivated to scrub than by offering them a future supply of warm clothing? Fast forward to the early 12th century, and you had the infamous deck scrubbing ledger, a detailed record of each ship's scrubbing history, complete with the names of the scrubbing crew, the amount of seawater used, yes, they measured that, and any fines incurred. Imagine being the hapless scribe tasked with writing down the details of every scrub. Ah, yes, that's another 3 liters of seawater and 3 sheep for the SS Grimy. This is going to be a long day. Logistics and supply chains, the Great Scrub Conspiracy. As trade expanded, so did the logistics of deck scrubbing. Think about it, how do you keep a fleet of longships clean when they're constantly on the move? The answer was the establishment of scrub supply lines. These supply lines consisted of a network of seaside suppliers who provided everything from scrub brushes made of bristles to extra barrels of seawater. The scrubbing supplies were often traded alongside more traditional goods like timber and amber, creating a thriving underground economy that would make any modern-day entrepreneur proud. Despite the occasional raiding party that would steal away with a shipment of brushes, the scrubbing supply chain flourished. Viking merchants would proudly boast about their superior scrub brushes, claiming they were made from the finest bristles of the rare Norse pig, a creature so elusive that its existence is now more myth than reality. One particularly ambitious supplier, Bjorn the Brushmaker, even went so far as to create a deluxe scrubbing kit, complete with a decorative bucket and scented oils, all marketed under the slogan, "Because even longships deserve a spa day." Record keeping, the numbers game. Now, when it comes to record keeping, the Vikings were nothing short of meticulous. The aforementioned deck scrubbing ledger was not just a simple notebook, it was a comprehensive tome filled with pages upon pages of scrub-related data. Each entry included the date, the ship's name, the crew assigned for the scrubbing, the weather conditions, because, yes, some scrubbing days were better than others, and the condition of the deck before and after the scrub. Historians have marveled at the sheer volume of detail contained within these ledgers. One entry reads, on July 4, 1002, the ship, Dragon's Fury, scrubbed the deck using 12 liters of seawater, 3 brushes, and 1 bucket. The weather was rainy, leading to an unexpected increase in deck slime. With such precise documentation, it's clear that the Vikings took their scrubbing duties seriously. The records were even used in court to settle disputes over scrubbing fines and to determine if a ship was indeed guilty of being too grimy. A grotesque anecdote, the scrubber's curse. Now, for the piece de resistance, a slightly grotesque anecdote that firmly cements the Viking deck scrubbing saga into the annals of lowbrow history. Legend has it that in the year 1000 AD, a particularly arrogant deck scrubber named Eric the Unkempt made a name for himself, not for his scrubbing prowess, but for an unfortunate incident involving a powerful sea creature known as the scrubbing kraken. One fateful day, Eric, perhaps a little too confident in his scrubbing skills, decided to challenge the kraken to a scrubbing duel. He claimed that if he could scrub his ship clean faster than the kraken could do so with its tentacles, he would become the greatest deck scrubber of all time. Long story short, the kraken was not amused. In a fit of what can only be described as tentacled rage, it emerged from the depths, dragged Eric into the water, and reportedly turned him into a living mop. The moral of the story: never challenge a sea creature to a scrubbing duel, especially one that can literally clean the deck with its appendages. Conclusion: the end of the line. So there you have it, the less than glamorous history of Viking ship deck scrubbing regulations. While we might marvel at their raiding prowess, it's the humble scrubbers that kept the ships afloat and the decks clean enough to avoid the shame of a dirty deck tax. Next time you think of Vikings, remember, behind the bloodlust and the horned helmets lay a surprisingly meticulous culture that cared deeply about cleanliness, even if it meant keeping a ledger that measured the amount of seawater used during scrubbing. And who knows? Perhaps the next time you're scrubbing your own deck at home, you'll find inspiration in Eric the Unkempt, minus the grotesque fate, of course. The lackluster history of Viking ship deck scrubbing regulations. Ah, the Vikings. Those raucous Norsemen with their horned helmets and penchant for pillaging, plundering, and generally causing mayhem across Europe. But behind the barbaric bravado and the blood-curdling battle cries lies an aspect of their society that rarely gets the spotlight it deserves: the meticulous and often comically convoluted regulations surrounding the scrubbing of their ship decks. Yes, you read that right. While many folks might think of Viking ships as vessels for conquest, they were also subject to a surprisingly intricate system of laws, taxes, and logistical considerations concerning cleanliness. Welcome aboard to the utterly thrilling world of Viking ship deck scrubbing regulations. Regional variations over time. First, let's set the stage with a little historical context. The Viking Age lasted from about 793 AD to 1066 AD, and during this time, the Norsemen spread their influence from Scandinavia to the farthest reaches of Europe, and even beyond. Just as their raids varied in ferocity, so too did their cleaning practices. Different regions had different scrubbing standards, with some places insisting on a rigorous cleaning schedule while others were a tad more laissez-faire. Let's just say that if you were a Norse sailor in the muddy waters of the Thames, your deck scrubbing might have been less about hygiene and more about keeping your feet from sticking to the wood. In Norway, for instance, the scrubbing regulations were as frigid as the waters themselves. Local chieftains would issue edicts proclaiming that decks must be scrubbed at the first sign of mold or mildew, which, given the damp climate, was practically a daily occurrence. In contrast, the Danes were far more cavalier about deck cleanliness, often allowing a more natural approach to grime, which no doubt added a rustic charm to their longships. And let's not even get started on the Swedes, who were known for their elaborate scrubbing parties, complete with mead and the occasional impromptu folk dance. Who knew that cleaning could be so festive? Laws, edicts, taxes, and ledgers. As the Vikings settled into new territories and established their own governance systems, the need for formal laws regarding ship maintenance became evident. The laws surrounding deck scrubbing were often woven into larger maritime regulations. In 10th century Iceland, for instance, the Althing, the earliest form of parliament, passed a rather peculiar edict. A ship's captain was required to keep a ledger documenting not only the number of voyages taken but also the frequency and method of deck scrubbing. Failure to maintain this record could result in fines, which, considering the Viking affinity for treasure, was no small matter. The scrubbing tax was particularly infamous. It was levied based on the size of the vessel and the overall cleanliness of the deck, an innovative way to incentivize deck hygiene. This tax, known as the skipper's scrub, was collected during the annual market in Hedeby, where merchants and shipmasters gathered to trade goods, share tales of conquest, and, of course, gossip about the cleanliness of each other's ships. If your deck was found wanting, you could expect a hefty fine, which, in a culture that prized honor and reputation, was akin to being branded a scoundrel. To enforce these laws, local chieftains often appointed scrubbing inspectors. Yes, you heard that right. These were individuals who roamed the harbors, examining decks with the same scrutinizing gaze one might reserve for a dubious stew at a feast. The inspectors would carry a scrub stick, not to be confused with a fishing spear, and use it to poke around the corners of the deck, checking for dirt and grime. If they found any evidence of neglect, they'd whip out their ledgers and record the infraction with an air of authority that would make even the most seasoned lawmaker blush. Logistics and supply chains. Now, let's dive into the logistics of deck scrubbing. You might think that a bucket of seawater and a handful of coarse sand would suffice, but the Vikings were nothing if not resourceful. Cleaning supplies were often procured through an elaborate supply chain that rivaled modern logistics networks, no small feat when the only thing separating you from the open sea was a flimsy dock and the occasional marauding rival. The primary ingredient in the Viking cleaning arsenal was, of course, seawater. But they also relied on a variety of natural materials like sand, ash from the hearth, and even crushed shells to scour the decks clean. This concoction was often referred to as Norse scrub mix, and it was said that the secret to a good scrub lay in the rhythm of the scrubbing motion. Some say it was almost ceremonial, like a pre-raid ritual to ensure the ship was clean and ready for battle. Supply routes for these scrubbing materials were managed in much the same way as the supply chains for their weapons. Sailors would often barter for cleaning supplies at coastal markets, trading fish and furs for bags of sand or buckets of pure seawater, as if there was an alternative. The more resourceful among them would simply collect materials during their voyages. After all, who needs a fancy supply chain when you can just snag a few buckets of sand from the beach? Record keeping with lots of specifics. As we've established, record keeping was paramount. The Vikings were not only warriors but also shrewd traders, and they understood the importance of meticulous documentation. The scrubbing records became a point of pride among ship captains, with many going so far as to commission elaborate runestones that commemorated their deck-cleaning feats. One notable record from the 11th century details the scrubbing schedule of a ship named the Sea Serpent. According to this ledger, the captain maintained a strict regimen. Decks were scrubbed every Thursday, with a thorough inspection every full moon. What's more, the ledger included specific details about the scrubbing crew, their roles, and even the time it took to complete the task. One entry reads, "Took the boys 3 hours to scrub the deck on the night of the full moon. Odin himself would be pleased with the gleam." But here's the kicker. If you ever found yourself in a position of having to explain your scrubbing habits, you'd better not be caught with a dirty deck. The Vikings had a saying, "Clean decks bring glory, dirty decks bring death." It was a bit melodramatic, but it underscored the seriousness with which these regulations were treated. One surprising, borderline grotesque anecdote. Now, let's wrap up our journey with a rather surprising anecdote that highlights the absurd lengths to which the Vikings would go to ensure their decks were spotless. In 1072, during a particularly harsh winter, a group of Viking sailors found themselves trapped in a fjord for weeks on end. As supplies dwindled, they resorted to some rather unorthodox scrubbing methods to keep the ship clean. Desperate times call for desperate measures, and these sailors, faced with the grim prospect of starvation, concocted a plan to use the only available resource, each other. They devised a system wherein one sailor would stand atop the deck while the others, in a show of camaraderie, and perhaps a touch of insanity, would scrub the deck using their own hair. Yes, you read that correctly. These brave souls took turns plucking out their own hair to fashion makeshift scrubbers. While one might argue the merits of using human hair as a cleaning tool, the event took a grotesque turn when the cabin boy, in a fit of mischief, decided to toss his used hair scrubber overboard. The resulting chaos led to a slippery deck, a misplaced foot, and a rather unfortunate fall into the icy waters. Legend has it that he emerged from the fjord shouting, "I've never felt so clean." In the end, while the Vikings are often immortalized for their fearsome raids and epic sagas, it's the quirks of their ship deck scrubbing regulations that reveal a different side of this fascinating culture. From regional variations and meticulous record-keeping to the absurdities of scrubbing taxes and the occasional grotesque anecdote, the Vikings remind us that even in the most ruthless of societies, there's always room for a little whimsy, and a lot of scrubbing. So next time you think of Vikings, remember, beneath the battle cries and blood-soaked axes, those longships were also vessels of cleanliness, sailing the seas with the grandest of scrubbing traditions. Scow. The lackluster history of Viking ship deck scrubbing regulations. When one thinks of the Vikings, images of fierce warriors conquering lands, navigating treacherous seas, and raiding coastal villages often come to mind. Yet, beneath the veneer of their notorious reputation lies an equally mundane, yet essential aspect of their maritime culture, the scrubbing of ship decks. While the Viking Age is often romanticized, the regulations surrounding deck maintenance reveal the more humdrum side of seafaring life that, surprisingly, played a pivotal role in their naval prowess and daily operations. Minor figures and petty rules. In the grand tapestry of Viking history, figures like Eric the Red and Leif Erikson overshadow the less glamorous characters who enforced the oft-overlooked regulations of ship maintenance. One such figure was Bjorn, the Broomstick, Halvorsen, a minor shipmaster from the mid-10th century, who took it upon himself to create the first set of formal scrubbing regulations. Bjorn's broomstick mandates outlined the frequency of deck scrubbing based on ship type and voyage length. For instance, he mandated that longships must be scrubbed at least once every fortnight during longer voyages, while Nars, the merchant vessels, could get away with a once-a-month cleaning. Bjorn's rules were often seen as petty by his contemporaries, and many a Viking ship crew would grumble about the time wasted on scrubbing. Nonetheless, his influence paved the way for future maritime ordinances. Following his lead, other shipmasters across Scandinavia began issuing their guidelines, often rivaling each other in their absurdity. One particularly notorious regulation came from the shores of Norway, where a local chieftain declared that deck scrubbing should be performed only by those who had never set foot on land for more than 3 moons, a clear jab at those who were deemed landlubbers. Case studies with dates and lists. While the Viking Age is replete with tales of exploration and conquest, it is also punctuated by the minutiae of maritime life, including deck scrubbing. The following case studies highlight the absurdity and significance of these seemingly trivial regulations. 1. The Great Deck Scrub of 991 CE. In this landmark year, a unique maritime summit was held in the town of Ribe, Denmark. Shipmasters from various Viking settlements convened to discuss the alarming number of barnacles found on ships returning from voyages. The summit resulted in the Ribe Resolution, which mandated that all ships must undergo a thorough scrubbing before the spring thaw. The regulations were enforced by a council of shipwrights who would inspect vessels and levy hefty fines for non-compliance. 2. The notorious scrubbing incident of 1042 CE, a lesser-known but pivotal event in Viking history, occurred when a ship crew from the settlement of Lærdal was caught scrubbing their deck with a mixture of seawater and a rare herb. The crew believed this concoction would ward off sea monsters. The local laws, however, prohibited the use of any substances other than salt water for scrubbing. The crew was fined and publicly humiliated, leading to a new regulation known as the Cleanse the Deck Decree, which emphasized the importance of using only the purest seawater for scrubbing. 3. The Scrubbing Standards of 1090 CE. By 1090, scrubbing regulations had evolved into a formalized system. A codex was discovered in the ruins of a longhouse in Sweden that outlined 3 distinct grades of scrubbing: basic, thorough, and divine. The basic scrub involved using a broom made of birch twigs, while the divine scrub required a special blend of seawater and crushed seashells, reserved for ships preparing for long voyages. This codex also detailed penalties for non-compliance, ranging from fines to community service in the form of additional scrubbing duties. Comparisons to other regions. When compared to other maritime cultures, Viking deck scrubbing regulations appear both amusing and surprisingly progressive. In the Mediterranean, for example, the ancient Greeks and Romans had their own methods of maintaining their ships, but they were often less formalized. The Greeks would scrub their triremes using a mixture of olive oil and sand, a practice that was more about preserving the ship's hull rather than maintaining cleanliness. Conversely, the Polynesians, who navigated the vast Pacific Ocean, had no formal scrubbing regulations. Instead, they relied on the ocean's natural cleansing properties, allowing barnacles and algae to be washed away through regular voyages. This lack of regulation led to a stark difference in ship maintenance philosophies. The Japanese, on the other hand, developed intricate shipbuilding techniques that incorporated natural anti-fouling materials, rendering scrubbing less of a concern. Their approach to maritime maintenance was less about cleanliness and more about harmony with nature. In comparison, Viking scrubbing regulations were a testament to their understanding of the importance of ship maintenance in ensuring successful voyages. Archaeological tidbits. Archaeological findings provide a fascinating glimpse into the Viking approach to ship maintenance, particularly in relation to deck scrubbing. Excavations of Viking longhouses have revealed an abundance of scrubbing tools, including brushes made from animal hair and brooms crafted from local vegetation. One notable find at the site of the Oseberg ship burial in Norway included a scrubbing broom alongside various artifacts, suggesting that even elite Vikings were not exempt from the chore of deck scrubbing. Additionally, preserved shipwrecks have shown signs of extensive barnacle growth, indicating that some crews neglected their scrubbing duties. Researchers have even discovered remnants of scrubbing materials, such as crushed seashells, which were likely used in more elaborate cleaning rituals. These archaeological insights illuminate the practical aspects of Viking seafaring life and underscore the importance of maintaining a clean vessel. Rhetorical questions. How did the scrubbing of a ship deck come to symbolize the very essence of Viking seafaring culture? And what can the seemingly trivial regulations of deck maintenance reveal about the social hierarchies and communal values of the Viking Age? Conclusion. The history of Viking ship deck scrubbing regulations serves as a reminder that even the most fearsome warriors had to engage in mundane tasks to ensure their maritime success. The minor figures and petty rules that emerged from this practice highlight the complexity of Viking society, where every detail mattered, even in the most unexpected ways. From the Great Deck Scrub of 991 CE to the notorious scrubbing incident of 1042 CE, these regulations reveal a culture that valued cleanliness and maintenance as much as it valued conquest and exploration. By comparing Viking practices to those of other maritime cultures and examining archaeological findings, we gain a deeper understanding of the Viking Age's social fabric and the intricate balance between chaos and order in their world. In the end, the seemingly lackluster history of Viking ship deck scrubbing regulations invites us to reconsider how we perceive the Viking legacy, not just as warriors and raiders, but as a society that understood the importance of every aspect of life, from the grandest battles to the most mundane chores. The lackluster history of Viking ship deck scrubbing regulations. When we think of the Vikings, images of towering longships cutting through the waves, fierce warriors raiding coastal settlements, and grand feasts filled with meat often come to mind. However, lurking beneath the surface of these fearsome seafaring folk is an unexpectedly mundane aspect of their maritime life, the regulation of deck scrubbing. This article delves into the surprisingly intricate and often humorous history of Viking ship deck scrubbing regulations, exploring minor figures, petty rules, case studies, regional comparisons, and archaeological tidbits. But one must ask, why were these regulations deemed necessary in the first place? And could scrubbing a deck have been more than just a chore for the Vikings? #### minor figures and petty rules. In the grand tapestry of Viking history, many figures remain obscured by the glory of legendary leaders like Ragnar Lothbrok or Harald Hardrada. Yet, it is often the minor figures who played crucial roles in establishing the regulations that governed everyday life, including the art of ship maintenance. One such character was Sigurd Flak, a lesser-known shipwright from the late 9th century, who is said to have authored the Skipsrangerskapsregler, ship scrubbing regulations, in 872 AD. Flakker's treatise, which has unfortunately not survived the ages, supposedly included detailed instructions on the proper techniques for scrubbing decks, including the use of specific brushes made from goat hair and the recommended intervals for cleaning. The regulations Flock proposed were quite peculiar. For instance, a rule stipulated that no Viking ship shall be scrubbed on a Tuesday, lest the scrubbing wash away the blessings of the gods for the week. This superstition was taken very seriously, leading to the infamous Tuesday scrubbing incident of 895 AD, where an entire fleet was said to have faced misfortune after violating this bizarre rule. In fact, it was recorded that 3 ships capsized during a storm, and the crew attributed the disaster to their disregard for Flocker's decree. Another minor figure, the matriarch Gudrun of the Fjords, insisted that only women could scrub the decks of Viking ships, claiming that their touch would ensure the ships remained swift and agile. Her opinion gained traction in some coastal villages, leading to a peculiar social structure where scrubbing became a feminine rite of passage. The deck divas, as they came to be known, were celebrated with feasts and songs, although they also faced ridicule from male warriors who deemed scrubbing a menial task beneath their valor. ###Case studies with dates and lists. Throughout Viking history, several notable events highlight the peculiarities of deck scrubbing regulations. The Great Scrubbing Dispute of 950 AD serves as a prime example. This conflict erupted in the town of Ribe, Denmark, when 2 rival ship crews claimed ownership over a set of scrubbing brushes that had been blessed by a local seer. The brushes were said to possess magical properties that guaranteed smooth sailing. The ensuing legal battle, documented in the Ribe Law Code, included a list of grievances. 1. Crew A claimed Crew B had stolen their scrubbing brushes under the cover of darkness, aided by a weasel. 2. Crew B countered that Crew A had used nefarious means to distract the local seer during the blessing ceremony. 3. Witnesses recalled hearing shouting and the sounds of clattering brushes as the dispute escalated. The case was eventually settled in court with a decree that both crews must share the brushes, leading to the establishment of the shared scrubbing protocol, which dictated that deck scrubbing must be performed in tandem, a unique practice that reportedly fostered camaraderie among rival crews. Another case study is the deck scrubbing fiasco of 1030 AD, which took place in Norway. A group of warriors, returning from a successful raid, found their ship's deck in disarray. In a fit of anger, they blamed the ship's scrubbers for not maintaining the vessel's cleanliness during their absence. The crew decided to enforce a new regulation: any scrubber found to be slacking shall be thrown overboard. This drastic measure led to a series of unfortunate accidents, where several innocent scrubbers were tossed into the cold waters of the fjord, only to be rescued later by the very crew they served. Historical records indicate that the practice was swiftly abandoned after realizing that most scrubbers could not swim. ##### Comparisons to other regions. While Viking ship deck scrubbing regulations may seem trivial, they present an intriguing contrast to maritime practices in other regions. In ancient Greece, ship maintenance was often overseen by specialized craftsmen known as nautai, who focused on the hull and rigging rather than the decks. The Greeks relied on olive oil as part of their cleaning regimen, a practice that preserved wood but left decks less pristine than their Viking counterparts. Could it be that the Vikings, with their focus on cleanliness, were more superstitious than their Mediterranean neighbors? In contrast, the Chinese maritime practices during the Tang dynasty prioritized the use of bamboo brushes for scrubbing, alongside the application of fragrant herbs to ward off pests. This contrasts sharply with the Viking approach, which was often dictated by superstition rather than practicality. The question remains, did the Vikings' obsession with scrubbing reflect a deeper cultural belief in the divine influence over their seafaring success? #Archaeological tidbits. Archaeological discoveries have provided insights into Viking maritime practices, including deck scrubbing. In the 1960s, excavations of the Oseberg ship in Norway revealed remnants of scrubbing brushes made of animal hair, alongside a trove of artifacts that spoke to the ship's ceremonial purpose. These brushes were inscribed with runes that suggested they were not merely tools but were imbued with protective qualities. The presence of these brushes makes one wonder, did the Vikings believe that the act of scrubbing could influence fate? Moreover, in a 2015 excavation of a Viking settlement in England, researchers uncovered a cache of scrubbing tools alongside a collection of wooden longboat fragments. Radiocarbon dating placed these tools around 950 AD, consistent with the Great Scrubbing Dispute. Interestingly, the scrubbing tools were found intermingled with remnants of feasting, suggesting a cultural connection between ship maintenance and communal gatherings. Did the Vikings view scrubbing as a prelude to celebration, an act that would ensure safe passage and favorable winds for their endeavors? Conclusion. The history of Viking ship deck scrubbing regulations may seem trivial at first glance, but when examined closely, it reveals a complex tapestry of cultural beliefs, social structures, and maritime traditions. The peculiar rules established by minor figures like Sigurd Flokr and Gudrun of the Fjords illustrate the intersection of superstition and practicality in Viking life. The case studies of disputes and disasters further highlight the significance of deck scrubbing, while comparisons to practices in other regions underscore the uniqueness of Viking maritime culture. As we ponder the significance of these regulations, we must ask ourselves, how did these seemingly mundane practices shape the identity of the Vikings as a seafaring people? And in our modern age, what can we learn from their dedication to maintaining the vessels that carried them into both conquest and commerce? The art of deck scrubbing, often overlooked, serves as a reminder that even the most trivial tasks can hold profound cultural significance. The lackluster history of Viking ship deck scrubbing regulations. When one thinks of the Vikings, images of fierce warriors and daring explorers often come to mind. However, beneath the layer of bloodthirsty raids and epic sagas lies a surprisingly mundane aspect of their maritime culture, deck scrubbing regulations. While not as thrilling as tales of conquest, the rules governing how these seafaring Norsemen maintained their ships reveal a fascinating glimpse into the minutiae of Viking life. What drove these fierce mariners to create such regulations? And could a lack of cleanliness have led to more than just a tarnished reputation? Minor figures and petty rules. The Viking Age, circa 793–1066 AD, was marked not only by grand voyages but also by a surprising level of organization among seafaring communities. While figures like Eric the Red and Leif Erikson dominated the historical narrative, lesser-known figures, such as Ragnhild the Scrubber, played crucial roles in the day-to-day operations of Viking ships. Ragnhild, supposedly the daughter of a chieftain, was reputed for her fierce dedication to cleanliness aboard the longships. It is said she once single-handedly organized a ship-wide scrub-down after a particularly messy raid on the British Isles. Among the more petty rules Ragnhild championed was the 3-day scrub rule, which mandated that every crew member must participate in deck scrubbing at least once every 3 days. Failure to comply resulted in a hefty fine of 1 sheep, a significant penalty in a culture where livestock represented wealth. Such regulations may seem inconsequential, yet they highlight the Vikings' understanding of collective responsibility. After all, a clean ship was a sign of respect and pride among warriors who would otherwise be perceived as barbaric. ###### Case studies with dates and lists. To fully appreciate the impact of deck scrubbing regulations, we can explore specific case studies that document their implementation. One notable incident occurred in 850 AD when the crew of the Drakkar of the North was found guilty of neglecting their cleaning duties after returning from a successful raid in Ireland. A local assembly, or thing, convened to address the issue, resulting in the infamous Drakkar Decree. This decree not only reinforced existing cleaning protocols but also introduced penalties for neglecting ship maintenance. Drakkar of the North Incident, 850 AD**. Key figures Bjorn the Brave, Captain, Ragnhild the Scrubber, shipmate. Violations Failure to clean decks for over 2 weeks. Consequences Fines imposed on crew members, ship's reputation tarnished. Outcome The Assembly voted to increase the frequency of mandated scrubbing from once every 3 days to once every 2 days. Another case arose in 930 AD involving the Sons of the North, a ship infamous for its unsanitary conditions. Historical records indicate that the stench emanating from the vessel became so unbearable that local ports refused them entry. After an embarrassing incident where the ship was turned away from a trading hub, the crew was compelled to hold a grand deck scrubbing event that drew significant public attention. This event became a local spectacle, with townsfolk gathering to witness the crew's penance, complete with songs and jests about the smelly sons. Sons of the North Incident, 930 AD**. Key figures Gunnar the Gritty, Captain, Freydis the Ferocious, shipmate. Violations Deck cleanings were neglected for over a month. Consequences Public shaming, forced to clean in front of an audience. Outcome instituted a weekly cleaning day, celebrated with a feast. Comparisons to other regions. Viking deck scrubbing regulations stand out not only for their peculiarity but also for their contrasts with maritime practices in other regions. In contrast to the Vikings, the Mediterranean maritime cultures of ancient Greece and Rome focused more on the maintenance of hulls and sails rather than deck cleanliness. Roman ships, for instance, had a more utilitarian approach to cleanliness, emphasizing structural integrity over aesthetics. The Roman naval fleet, particularly during the Punic Wars, prioritized speed and combat readiness, which often meant sacrificing cleanliness in favor of efficiency. In the East, the Chinese maritime tradition, as seen during the Tang and Song dynasties, placed a significant emphasis on ritual and symbolism in ship maintenance. While cleanliness was valued, it was often intertwined with spiritual beliefs and practices, which were less about regulations and more about cultural significance. The Chinese regarded their ships as extensions of themselves, thus cleaning was imbued with a spiritual component, an aspect that was relatively absent in Viking practices. Archaeological tidbits. Archaeological finds have played a pivotal role in painting a picture of Viking maritime life, including their scrubbing practices. The excavation of the Oseberg ship burial in Norway, dated to the early 9th century, provided insights into the daily lives of Vikings. Among the artifacts discovered were scrubbing brushes and cleaning tools, suggesting that the practice of maintaining ship cleanliness was not merely a regulation but a significant part of their culture. Another interesting find occurred at the site of the Gokstad ship, also in Norway, where archaeologists uncovered an assortment of organic materials, including remnants of tar and pitch. These materials were not just for ship sealing, they were also used in deck treatments to repel water and pests. This find implies that Vikings may have had a more sophisticated understanding of ship maintenance than previously thought, blending practical needs with their cultural norms. Furthermore, the discovery of a large, well-preserved Viking longship in Dublin, Ireland, provided evidence of scrubbing-related tools, such as wooden paddles with rough surfaces. These implements likely served dual purposes, not just for rowing but also for scrubbing the decks. This archaeological evidence supports the existence of scrubbing regulations and the importance of cleanliness in Viking society. Rhetorical questions to hook curiosity. What if the Vikings' success as explorers was not solely due to their superior shipbuilding and navigation skills, but also linked to their obsessive dedication to cleanliness? Could it be that the seemingly trivial act of scrubbing a deck played a crucial role in the Vikings' ability to dominate the seas? As we dive deeper into the uncharted waters of Viking history, one must wonder, in a world where warriors are glorified, could the unsung heroes of ship maintenance, the scrubbers, hold the key to a more nuanced understanding of Viking culture? Conclusion. The history of Viking ship deck scrubbing regulations may lack the vivid drama of epic battles and legendary conquests, yet it reveals much about the complexities of Viking society. From minor figures like Ragnhild the Scrubber to significant incidents like the Drakkar of the North, these regulations reflect a culture that valued not just conquest but also the dignity of their vessels. As we continue to excavate and analyze our understanding of the Viking Age, perhaps it is time to give due credit to the unsung heroes who scrubbed the decks and kept the ships of the North seaworthy, those who, quite literally, helped the Vikings sail into history. And that's a wrap on today's journey through the wild world of topic. Who knew? Quick recap of the main point. Talk about a plot twist. Here's a surprising nugget to leave you buzzing. Did you know that? Surprising closing fact. It's a game changer. If you enjoyed our little adventure, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe for more mind-blowing content, and drop a comment below with your thoughts. We love hearing from you. And if you're hungry for more, check out our related episodes on related topics. There's plenty more where that came from. Lastly, if you want to drift off with us on repeat, just turn on loop, and let this episode play until you dream of related topic. Sweet dreams.